If you've watched my channel for a while, then it should come as no surprise when I say that Flood Escape 2 is my favorite Roblox game. It's a game that I have more memories cherishing than any other game on Roblox, and it's one that I have a lot of passion for. However, earlier this year, when I decided to start recording content for this game, I had slowly but surely undergone a massive increase in skill. Obviously, I'm nowhere near one of the best players in the game, as I only recently started recording Flood Escape 2 content and truly testing my skill, but I'm still proud of what I've accomplished, and I want to talk about some of my greatest accomplishments on this game. This video was mainly inspired by Baneworth's video, so I'll link that one in the description. Now, there are a few rules for this list that I feel I should bring up. First rule, only one version of each map is allowed for the list, and that's whatever the hardest version is. Second rule, in regards to maps that I beat on the legacy version of Flood Escape 2 community maps before that got privated recently, I will still count those for the list. Third and final rule, this is just my opinion. There's definitely going to be some maps that others would have placed differently on the list, and I'll be curious to see what your own rankings would be. Anyways, without further ado, let's dive right into what I consider to be the top 10 hardest Flood Escape 2 community maps I've ever beaten. Kicking off this list is a map that's actually one of the maps in the main game, Sub-Zero Sphere. Of all the main game maps I've soloed, which really isn't that many now that I think about it, this one easily challenged me the most. This opening part shows little mercy, as you have to navigate some admittedly basic platforming at a respectively fast pace, and because you have to go so fast, it's very easy to slip up the platforming if you're not careful. However, the next part is where the map really starts to show its teeth. Introducing longer jumps and more complicated platforming, this part is very challenging to get through, still maintaining the quick pacing introduced in the first part. After going through the hallway with a sideways wall jump maneuver, most of what I said about the second room applies to this room as well, except with a few more wall jumps and even a wraparound thrown into the mix. However, while everything I just talked about is arduous to some degree, it does get pretty consistent after a while. The same cannot be said about this next part. The concept simply involves you outrunning an avalanche for a 50-second time stretch. Sounds easy, right? Well, what if this part took everything hard about the previous parts and amplified it to the max in this final part? The complex maneuvers that take a while to learn, the wall jumps that have to be approached very precisely, and this part even introduces a pool you have to swim your way through in a way where you have to save as much air as you can while getting this button. Also, don't think that avalanche chasing you is slow. It will catch up with you if you're not quick on your feet at every moment. On my winning attempt, I only had a couple minor flaws in terms of platforming, but that was almost enough to cost me, as the avalanche came eerily close to ending my run at the very end. So overall, the fast pacing and somewhat sophisticated nature of the platforming makes this map consistently challenging from start to finish, but it's at the bottom of the list because, as I implied earlier, once you learn this map enough, it becomes very consistent and you'll find yourself getting far runs quite frequently. That doesn't mean the journey up to that point won't test your patience. Monocrex. One of the most substantial accomplishments in my career, as this is the first map that truly tested and increased my skill, given that it's the oldest completion on this entire list. Anyways, out of all of the maps from Enzo's timeline that I've beaten, this one is easily the hardest map in my opinion. I know some will argue that Focus is harder, and I can kind of see why they would, but no map within that timeline gave me a struggle quite like this map did. Though it may not seem like it at first, because the part kicking off this map is pretty easy. Don't be fooled by the first part's simplicity, because in the very next part, you're dealing with all sorts of problems. First off, unless you watch and study a video beforehand, good luck trying to figure out the correct path in this part. Even after studying other videos, I still had a hard time remembering everything and had to rewatch it multiple times over in order to properly memorize it all. And even then, that's not all. You have to get through this pathway as fast as possible in order to get to the teleport block in time. So here comes another layer of difficulty on top of the memory. Then after that, the third part isn't the worst thing ever, but it still has its own challenges. The main example being the fact that you still have to maintain a fast pace throughout in order to reach the next part in time. The platforming is fairly simple in this part other than this small area, so you don't really have to worry about that in this part. So far, it really only seems like there was one difficult part so far. Why is this above Sub-Zero Sphere? Oh, that's right, the climbing section that follows. To this day, this is still one of the single fastest climbing sections I've ever done. You have to navigate your way up a tower and learn every single movement at an absolutely staggering pace. One slight error, miscalculation, or hesitance, and you might as well kiss your run goodbye. You have no time to breathe whatsoever, and not to mention, this part lasts for 40 whole seconds. Yep, 40 seconds of brutally fast-paced platforming. Thankfully, that's the hardest part out of the way, but you still have 2 more parts to get through, so don't celebrate just yet. The part right after the climb has some fairly uncomfortable platforming, but as long as you're careful while still keeping pace, you should be fine. And the last part is basically just the don't choke part. Just keep running and jumping across the platforms, and that should be it. Back when this map was my hardest completion ever, I hyped up its difficulty a lot. Looking back on it now, while the memory part and especially the tower part do still hold up in terms of difficulty, I may have over-exaggerated the overall map's difficulty a bit. Still, this map gave me a lot of trouble, and it certainly shaped how I approach difficult maps given how early this accomplishment was in my career. Rather interestingly enough, my perception of this map's difficulty has actually changed quite a bit over time. Back when I beat this map, I called it my new hardest at the time, but looking back on it now, the map I previously called my hardest before this was definitely harder. That's not to take anything away from this map, as it is still massively difficult in many ways. The first 3 parts have several things in common that make them similarly difficult. You have to maintain a consistently quick and flowy pace throughout these first 3 parts. The first part is easy enough as long as you can quickly get consistent with the wall jump and the wraparound, but the second part is when you really have to put the burners on. This climbing section is relatively brief, but it packs a big punch because your ascent must be quick and have a natural flow all the way up, which isn't helped by the platforming challenges you must overcome. Like the wall jump you have to jump around a pillar to reach, and the wall jump towards the end of the climb. The third part isn't quite as hard as the second part in terms of platforming, but the pacing is noticeably faster. And this part does still have its fair share of challenging bits, with the main example being the jump from this diagonal ledge to the wall jump. After that is a fairly tight swimming section, which thankfully is pretty short, but is still very claustrophobic and awkward to navigate your way through. The part following that is kind of a breather, as it's somewhat lenient in terms of pacing, and the platforming isn't too big of a deal, but immediately following it is the hardest part of the map, this large-scale tower climb. The most notable aspects of this part that'll likely make your blood boil are the transition from the truss to the circle platform, the wraparound onto a wall jump, the long jump at the end, and don't forget how fast you have to go throughout all this. Well, except for maybe the last jump, but even then, it's still best for you not to waste too much time. Once you're done with that though, the rest of the map isn't too bad. The following part is probably the easiest part in the whole map, and the last part seems intimidating due to its stick-out wraparounds and long jump at the end, but the lava wall is incredibly slow, so you have a good amount of time to prepare your jumps. I managed to get through the last part on my first try, which could have just been me getting lucky, but I still don't feel like it was much of a struggle despite how nervous I got. When I initially beat this map, I will admit I was a bit too quick in my judgment when I called this my hardest at the time of completing it, especially when compared to the previous map I called my hardest. Speaking of which... I really don't like this map. So much of its difficulty just feels cheap and artificial. When I break down what makes this map difficult, I'm also ranting about why I've taken a dislike towards it. Anyways, the first room is pretty easy. Your only concern is timing the jump from the second button and getting out of the first room quickly. However, right after that, this map immediately starts putting you through the ringer as it very quickly throws a tightrope and an awkwardly placed button your way. But that's the least of your problems here, because once you get past that, you're greeted with one of the hardest parts of the map immediately. This extremely cramped hallway with tiny platforms that gives you very little time to get through. Not only that, but some of those small platforms are slightly submerged in the lava, so have fun trying to sight read that. This hallway is the main reason why this map was placed above Hyperspeed V3, because none of the platforming in that map comes anywhere close to the sheer stupidity found here. Anyways, once you're past that, this climbing section isn't nearly as bad as the hallway, but it still has its own set of challenges. There are still a fair amount of small platforms requiring plenty of precision throughout, and while the pacing isn't anywhere near as fast as Monocrex's pacing, you still should go at a fairly quick pace throughout just to be safe. That is, unless you take this massive shortcut up the truss, which saves a good amount of time to the point where, on my winning attempt, I made a pretty noticeable mistake towards the top and still got out unscathed. And then there's this absolutely dreadful swimming part. Figuring out how to properly squeeze your way through everything, especially with the janky physics at certain points, makes this part almost as bad as the hallway from earlier. Anyways, once you're past that, there's another hallway part which thankfully is a lot shorter, but it still offers the same sort of platforming found in the previous hallway. Then there's the last part, which I managed to do almost entirely on my first try, other than 2 instances on the first wall jump. The platforming still feels very awkward, but thankfully this part is very forgiving in terms of pacing, so you have plenty of time to prepare your jumps, which honestly just felt like this map basically apologizing for all the dumb stuff it threw at me earlier. So yeah, if I didn't make it clear already, this map throws a lot of dumb stuff at you just for the sake of artificially inflating the difficulty. If I wasn't going for this map as the new hardest at the time, I don't think I would have ever tried to complete it. Yet even after all that, it's still not my least favorite map in the game. There's another map later on that I despise even more, which, oh boy, we will get to. Now, this map isn't any higher on the list because it's a pretty short map, only lasting about 1 minute and 20 seconds. But still, this map just threw so much at me, and I don't ever wish to put anyone else through that. Not even my worst enemy. Oh boy, I have stories about this map. Rough Sketch is the only map on this list that I actually had to re-beat because the first time I beat it, my mic wasn't on. And given just how hard this map is, that was absolutely painful. Anyways, this map hits you with a hard part right away as you have to make your way up this small climb consisting of a high wall jump, a fairly tough wraparound, and these small platforms, all requiring very precise movement in order to properly execute. And don't forget to do this part quick, just like you would with any other hard map. And after that comes a large-scale tower climb with all sorts of tough platforming challenges. The highlights of this part in terms of difficulty include but aren't limited to this diagonal wraparound, these 2 very long wraparounds, these tiny platforms going in a zigzag pattern, and this wraparound onto the truss. This part isn't as fast as the previous part, which is proven by the fact that I got to the top of the climb with a full 2 seconds to spare, but don't think you can go slow in this part. However, from that point forward, little to none of that leniency is present anywhere. When you get through this door, make sure you're cutting corners around the circle in this room to save as much time as possible. The next part consists of precise box jumps and a swimming section that just feels like a tighter version of the hyperspeed swimming part. Once you get both buttons in the swimming part, you head back out through the boxes and are introduced to the final 2 parts. The second to last part is basically a warm-up for the last part. Thin platforms, far wraparounds, and awkward maneuvers, all being done at a rapid pace. However, as I said, that's only the warm-up, as the final climb that follows it is without a doubt the hardest part. This part takes everything difficult established in the previous parts and ramps it up to an insane degree. While the wraparounds admittedly aren't the hardest in this part, almost everything else is likely to mess you up one way or another. The tiny platforms and tightropes in this part are just ridiculous, and the far jumps in this part only add to how hard this all is. Not only are you having to deal with all of this at once, but this part is the fastest part of the whole map. You have to navigate the advanced platforming insanely quickly, but there's just one issue. Remember when I said there were tightropes in this part? Well, the tightrope towards the end of the climb is almost guaranteed to get you stuck, and you basically have to get lucky enough to break free before the lava can get you. This tightrope ended more of my runs than I'd like to admit, and I think you could see why that's the case. Once that part's done, just hit the 5 buttons at the end before the max time and you win. This map is a noticeable step up in difficulty from the previous 4 maps, as when it comes to fast pacing and tough platforming, this map delivers on both of those attributes in spades. Something that you'll start to see more of as we continue to go further into the list. Huh, how interesting. The second map on this list that starts with the word hyper. I wonder if that'll be the last one. Anyways, hyperspace was another substantial accomplishment, as this was the first map I've ever beaten that's on the hardest Flood Escape 2 community maps list right now. This map shows you its difficulty right away, as the first part requires a breakneck pace from you immediately. The part following this doesn't let up either, as you have to be practically flawless in all of your maneuvers while occasionally dealing with claustrophobic corridors. This theme remains consistent for the following 2 rooms as well. It's difficult, but nothing too crazy just yet. You have to learn the fastest possible ways to make your way through each part. Something that's gonna be a theme for pretty much the whole map. Remember when I said so far it's difficult but nothing too crazy? Well, that is until you get to one of 3 massively difficult parts. This first climb is one of the most daunting climbing sections I've ever done, as it has some incredibly fast pacing which requires the fastest possible ways to navigate all the platforming. Also, you're dealing with that kind of difficulty for an entire 40 seconds. Sound familiar? Finding the fastest possible way to navigate your way up the tower and trying to execute it flawlessly on a consistent basis is massively challenging and will test your patience big time. The platforming itself isn't the hardest thing ever, but the unforgiving pace makes it feel like it is. However, that's only one of the insanely difficult parts, because following that tower is the single hardest swimming section I've ever done, and we just talked about the real end swimming section not too long ago. Every single turn must be done to absolute perfection if you even want a chance at reaching each of the air tanks in time, especially in the case of this second air tank. Not to mention, it's rather easy to get lost if you don't already know where you're supposed to go. It takes a special kind of deviousness to make a swimming part this fast-paced. After you get past that, the wickedly fast pacing doesn't stop there. There's still one more climbing section to go, and it's just as fast as the first one. It's not as long as the other one, but there is another factor that makes it just as difficult as the first tower and the swim, and that's nerve control. The fast pacing combined with how nervous this part made me was more than enough to make this part just as hard, if not even harder than the previous 2 parts. Getting consistent with all 3 of these parts and having to do all of them back to back single-handedly put this map all the way into the top 5. And if the parts before those 3 parts were just as hard, this would honestly be a very easy top 3 pick. Definitely a massive step up in difficulty from the map that this was based on. Remember when I said this earlier? There's another map later on that I despise even more, which, oh boy, we will get to. Well, Extravaganza is the map I was talking about. I could not stand this map at all, and I have plenty of reasons for that. Also, one unique thing about this map is that when it comes to pacing, your main threat isn't actually the flood, but rather the max time, meaning you're in a time crunch throughout the entire map. The first part isn't too bad, just hit every button reasonably fast and you should be okay. However, immediately following that, you start to see what makes this map so insufferable. You're introduced to a brief yet awkward swimming part with a stupidly blind transition out of it. Following that, you're dealing with small platforms that you're better off doing in first person. And if the real end has taught us anything, small platforms and first person gameplay are absolutely nightmarish. And this platform in particular is such a massive choke point. The transition out of this part isn't much better, as you have to stay in first person while hopping up through small ledges in this vent just to save enough time. Thankfully, the swimming section that follows this is pretty easy, but you still have to make sure you're going fast because of the timer. This map decides to throw you the biggest screw you ever with this next part. This lava mines part is actually miserable to play. As if the small platforms from earlier weren't bad enough, try dealing with small platforms confined in a hallway small enough for you to hit your head. The stupidity doesn't stop there though. Now you're jumping your way up other small platforms that require very specific alignment and timing in order for you to properly land on them. Once you're done with that, the next part isn't as bad, but it still has its own set of problems. The most notable aspects of this part are this first jump with the rigid platforms, the wraparound under another low ceiling, and the jump from this broken bridge onto the wall jump. However, following that is another absolutely painful part that actually gives me flashbacks to an earlier entry. This replica of the hallway in the real end takes everything that made that part cancerous and amps it up to an even higher degree than before. Some of the platforms are even smaller and the layout is even more awkward. The worst aspect of this part is this little bit where you have to jump onto this tiny ledge, hit the button in the vent, and head back onto the ledge. Sounds simple enough until you realize that in order to land on the ledge from the vent, you have to stop moving at the absolute perfect time in order to avoid walking too far, and then immediately start moving again only milliseconds later. This maneuver is absolutely miserable, and nothing else in this part makes up for it. You copied the worst part of the real end and somehow made it worse. Why would you do that? After that, the next three parts are thankfully pretty easy, so you do get a breather for a moment. Just don't forget to keep going moderately fast. But oh, don't think you're out of the woods just yet, because this map just had to throw one last curveball at you. This part might just have the smallest platforms in the entire map, and that's up against some stiff competition. Not to mention, you have to deal with all that while still keeping up a somewhat quick pace just to survive. What a dirty thing for this map to pull after all that BS. I feel very confident in saying that this is my least favorite map I've ever beaten. As bad as the real end was, at least it was a fairly short map, and it really only had 2 truly awful areas. This map is insufferable in several areas, and I have no problem avoiding this map now that I've beaten it. Stay away from extravaganza at all costs. Before we get into the top 3, let's look at some quick honorable mentions that weren't quite hard enough to make the list, but still deserve some time in the spotlight. Focus. This map is basically what would happen if you combined Monocrex and Hyperspace, except the pacing isn't as fast as either of those two maps. The Overflow. If everything else in this map was as fiendishly difficult as the first tower climb, this absolutely would have made the list. Shutdown. Definitely a very fast-paced and unforgiving map, but my progress rate was surprisingly natural in this map. Thaumaturgic Rifts. My most recent completion at the time of this video. This map is fast-paced and decently challenging, but didn't make me struggle the way I thought it would. And finally, Underside. Similar to the Overflow, the difficulty in this map is kind of carried by the climbing section, with only the occasional challenge found anywhere else. Here we are, the top 3. The 3 maps that honestly were always destined to be in at least one of these spots. Anyways, the map opening up this top 3 is none other than Cockmock. I won't pretend I have anything to say to pad out the runtime, so let's cut right to the chase with this opening part. One interesting thing about this map is that it has two separate paths you can choose. Even though everyone else I've seen would go right, I always went on the left path, so that's the path I'll talk about for this spot. This opening part already throws plenty of challenging stuff at you with far jumps and complicated... Bro, what? With far jumps and complicated wraparounds that, as you may have guessed, requires you to go fast. The wraparounds are hard enough, but this far jump in particular is a very noticeable choke point in this part, and I've died there more times than I would like to admit. Once you start to get past that part more consistently, you then have to answer to the climbing section that follows. Now, this part is definitely fast, but you could make a small mistake and still potentially get past it unscathed. The bad news is, you're likely going to be making way more than just one mistake trying to learn and get consistent with the platforming. There's plenty of awkward turns and tight crevices that you have to navigate your way through. While there is a lot of rather complex platforming that you have to do quickly, this part does get pretty consistent after a while. However, this next part completely throws out any consistency built up from the previous two parts. Out of nowhere, you're thrown into this absolutely brutal climbing section. If you thought monocreks and hyperspace were fast, this part completely blows both of them out of the water, and one look at the footage will immediately tell you why. This part could genuinely fit right in if it were put in either of the top two maps, as it genuinely rivals the hardest parts in those two maps. The lava rise is so fast that you have to be absolutely flawless, and every single movement has to flow as naturally as possible in order to ensure you keep up the insane pace throughout. Despite only being half as long as the monocreks climb and the hyperspace climb, this part manages to be noticeably harder than either of those parts. That's how densely packed the difficulty is in this part. Once you get past unequivocally the hardest part, only one part remains. This last part has some easy platforming, but you still have to go really fast and time your jumps right for these last two buttons. All in all, when this map gets hard, it's absolutely brutal. The tough platforming at the start and the punishingly fast tower climb are more than enough to put this map all the way into the top 3. But there are two things keeping this map out of the top 2. First off, this map is pretty short, clocking it at 1 minute and 20 seconds. Secondly, the difficulty does start to trail off at the tail end of the map. Still, Cogmok is absolutely brutal in many areas, and you will take a beating if you tend to complete it. Here we are, the runner-up, Oilfield Purgatory. As it turns out, Hyperspeed V3 isn't the only time where I initially called a map my new hardest, only to later realize I was overselling the difficulty. Even though this map isn't the new hardest accomplishment I thought it was at the time, that doesn't mean it wasn't still an absolute monster of a map to beat. Straight away, this first part doesn't play around, as the pacing shows how unforgiving it is right out of the gate. It's very difficult to get away with any slight error, and it stays that way for the first 40 seconds, as the platforming may not be that hard on its own, but any generosity in the platforming is taken away by the pacing, making it way easier to mess up if you don't know what you're doing. Some of the jumps that are made way harder with the pacing are this sideways wall jump, the transition out of this other wall jump, and these two jumps involving this cargo container. After the first 40 seconds, the two parts following that are somewhat easy, as while you still have to be fast, the platforming is very easy, so you're less likely to mess up. The only thing you really have to worry about are this cylindrical wraparound and this sideways wall jump. After that, there's this part with the two buttons that you must hit quickly, and then you're hit with the hardest part of the map, this 30-second tower climb. Honestly, there really isn't that much for me to say about this climb that I haven't already said about maps like Hyperspeed V3 or Hyperspace. What I will say is that this map takes what was hard about those two climbing sections and makes that 10 times harder. The pacing is ridiculously fast, and the platforming is very easy to mess up if you're not precise. The wall jumps towards the beginning and the middle are especially guilty of this, as you need to set up the perfect angles while still going as fast as possible. Once you're out of that tower, you still have to move quickly as you jump your way up this metal framing to get the button at the top of it. After hitting that button at the top, there's still one more part left. From what I've heard, a lot of people actually haven't struggled too much with this last part. I am jealous of those other players because this part was painfully hard to get past. You have to be pretty much flawless while dealing with a faster running speed, and the faster speed makes you feel like you're in less control of your character's momentum. There's also this rotating wraparound which can really screw up your momentum and make you lose valuable time. Thankfully, once you get past that last part, it's a done deal. There really isn't much more I could say about this map that I haven't already said about other maps, other than the fact that it takes attributes from those other maps and cranks up the difficulty enough to make its way all the way up into the top 2. So, what could possibly be harder than a map like this? Oh, just you wait. Here we are. Number 1. The hardest map I've ever completed. When I went out in search of the map that would perfectly encapsulate the pinnacle of my career, it was no easy journey. I combed through many maps across the entire landscape of Flood Escape 2 community maps to find the one that would truly fit into place. And then, it happened. I managed to find and complete a map that tested me more than any other map I've ever beaten. And that map is Hyper. Out of every map I've ever completed, no map gave me quite the same beating this map did. The opening part is basically a warm-up for what's to come, giving you a taste of the main source of the difficulty, the pace that demands you to be pretty much flawless from the very beginning to the very end, with platforming that may not seem difficult on its own, but becomes far more difficult once you take the pacing into account. Following the first part is a build-up which, once again, because of the pacing, requires absolute perfection out of you, pushing you to try and get consistent with precise camera work and timing. Then, we get to the first tower climb, one of the single hardest parts I've ever managed to do. The insane pacing that you must traverse this map at is something that cannot be exaggerated. All the elaborate maneuvers and even some air dives that you have to do in order to simply survive past this part make this an absolutely brutal part. But it certainly won't be the last time a part in this map gets this brutal. After that, the next part isn't much easier. While the pacing does get a little more forgiving towards the end of this part, you still have to traverse as fast as possible to even get to that point. Not to mention, there are various obstacles that will mess you up a lot more than you would expect. These 2 jumps leading to this zip line are deceptively hard to read, and the transition from the truss to the platform requires a quick yet very precise air dive in order to keep pace. However, once you're done with that part, you do thankfully get a 10-second break while this elevator descends. Make sure you've caught your breath while you could, because when you get out of this elevator, the platforming in the part that follows may not be that difficult, but you still have to go as fast as possible despite that not appearing to be the case just yet. After you zipline out of this part, the build-up still requires the same pace as pretty much the rest of the map, but this time, there's some tougher platforming standing in your way. This far wall jump gap and the wraparound between the boxes are especially daunting, as you're very likely to mess it up if you don't know the exact way to maneuver them. Following that comes the second tower climb, and remember when I said the first climb wouldn't be the last time a map got that brutal with its difficulty? That's because this part's just as punishing, if not even more, because just like the first climb, you have to navigate your way through respectively challenging platforming at an absolutely rapid pace with no breathing room whatsoever. It's not enough to just not make any mistakes. You have to find the most optimal maneuver for everything in this part. Once you're past that part and have gotten to the final part, just go fast and don't mess up. Once you do that last part, it's all over now. If I haven't made it clear already, the respectively difficult platforming combined with the unfathomably blistering pace that's required of you puts this map beyond any other map I've beaten before and after it. No other map put me through quite the struggle that this map did, and finally beating it was every bit as satisfying as you can imagine. Everything I've mentioned before makes this the hardest Flood Escape 2 map I've ever beaten. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of the video. Throughout my admittedly rather short career, I genuinely felt myself grow as a Flood Escape 2 player in terms of both skill and knowledge of the more competitive side of this community. I'm fully aware that I'm not even close to being one of the best players out there, as I've seen plenty of other players that could pull off accomplishments that I could only dream of. Even with that in mind, I'm still proud of what I've accomplished in Flood Escape 2. However, my journey with this game is far from over, as I plan to try and go for even tougher maps and pull off even bigger feats. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more content like this. Thank you for watching this video, and take care until next time.